as well as for posting of the recording of the proceedings on the agency's website. This meeting is also being live streamed on Access Health CT website. And as we go through today's agenda, which will focus on various audit reports and a question and answer period, I want to make sure that participants are reminded to use their name when speaking so that we can follow the conversation and accurately record the minutes. We will be taking a few roll call votes for various action items. And the first of those is a roll call for attendance. So with that, I'll pause and ask for attendance by roll.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. Claudia Gualtieri.
Here.
Grant Ritter.
Here.
Thomas McNeil. Mr. McNeil. Okay, he was on. I see Mr. McNeil.
Hey, Tom, are you there? Can you hear us?
If you could unmute, please.
I'm here.
Thank you.
Yeah.
Matt Broekman.
Here.
And Carlene Zambetti.
Here.
Thank you, everyone.
This is Claudio again. And with that, I'll request that the members of the Access Health CT Senior Leadership Team briefly introduce themselves as well.
So, good morning, all. James Michelle, Access Health Connecticut.
Good morning, everyone. Holly Zwick, Director of Finance, Access Health Connecticut.
Good morning, everyone. Susan Rich By, Access Health Connecticut, Director of Legal and Governmental Affairs.
Good morning, everyone. Glenn Jurgen, Director of Human Resources with Access Health Connecticut.
All right, this is Claudio again. Brings us to our next agenda item, which is opportunity for public comment. We had requested written public comment ahead of this meeting and had not received any. I'll pause for a second just to confirm there's no late additions, Margot, and if not, we would move on.
There were no additional public comments. Thank you.
Thank you. Next item for business then is a review and approval of our meeting minutes from November 8th, 2023, when the audit committee last had its regular meeting. Is there a motion for approval of such minutes?
Yes, this is Grant. Motion to approve.
Grant, motion is made. Do I have a second?
This is Carlene. I'll second.
Great, thank you. Carlene seconded. Any discussion, edits, or corrections on the draft meeting minutes from November the 8th? Seeing none, I will request a roll call vote for approval of the minutes.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. Claudio Gualtieri.
Yes.
Grant Ritter.
Yes.
Thomas McNeil.
I'll abstain because I wasn't at that meeting.
Thank you, Mr. McNeil. Carlene Zambetti.
Yes.
And Matthew Broekman.
Yes.
Thank you.
All right. With that, the next item, this is Claudio again, is an introduction of new auditors. And for that, I'll turn to Holly, Director of Finance.
Great. Thank you, Mr. Chair and members of the committee. Good morning. Access Health CT is required to solicit proposals at least once every 3 years for financial, legal, bond, underwriting, and other professional services. This is pursuant to Connecticut General Statutes 38A-1082A of our enabling legislation and pursuant to our procurement policy for contracting for personal services. In addition, as a quasi-public agency of the state of Connecticut, Access Health CT may not contract with the same person, firm, or corporation to conduct financial audits of the agency for more than 6 consecutive years pursuant to Connecticut CGS 1-127. Therefore, Access Health was required to solicit proposals in fiscal year 2024 for a new vendor to provide audit services. And we were not permitted to select our most recent auditors as we had contracted with them already for 6 years. Whittlesey was selected as the new firm to provide audit services for Access Health CT for the new audits for fiscal year 24. Whittlesey was engaged as the audit services vendor for the first 6 years of the exchange. Susan Rich Bai will introduce the financial and programmatic audit requirements before turning it over to Whittlesey to cover the new audits. Thank you.
Thank you, Holly, and thank you, Mr. Chair, members of the committee. Each year, Access Health is required to have an independent auditor complete financial and programmatic audits of the exchange pursuant to state and federal requirements. The federal programmatic audit looks at the exchange's program activities, including compliance with requirements for eligibility determinations for participation in exchange programs and the insurance affordability programs, and also enrollment in qualified health plans through the exchange, and for the processes and procedures that are in place to prevent improper eligibility determinations and enrollment transactions. The financial audit is required pursuant to both state and federal requirements. So at this point in time, we are about to start work with Whittlesey, our new auditors, for both the financial and programmatic audits. And I will turn it over to Whittlesey. Thank you.
Thank you. Good morning, everybody. My name is Tom Goldfuss. I'm the partner at Whittlesey and primarily responsible for ensuring that the audit and the programmatic audit be completed. So we have the introductory slides here for you, and we'll talk about the planning process of our audit. Thank you. So the engagement team is on these two slides. Of course, you have myself, the concurring partner on the engagement, the one who does the final, second review of the engagement with me is Lisa Wills. She heads up our nonprofit niche at the firm. She has over 30 years experience and does the second review on just about every quasi-public entity as well. I should mention briefly as well, I do run the firm's quasi-public practice, so that's within our nonprofit and governmental niche. Ed Sullivan was the partner on the engagement 6 years ago and from your inception as well. So he's still with the firm. He's more of a consulting partner with us. So he's somebody that has some history with you, some institutional knowledge, and will be involved in some capacity along the way as we transition into the new role for the next few years and to provide some of that experience as well. The next slide is more of the management team. Jean Callan is a senior manager at the firm. She was also involved with the audits when you first began as an entity and has a lot of institutional knowledge. I do have another manager. His name is Matt Burry. He's going to be working with Jean as well, more on a day-to-day basis. So Jean will be more working with me to review all the work, the planning, and of course, using her institutional knowledge on setting this up as we go forward. And then a little bit unique to our firm is we have an IT group within our firm that specializes primarily in IT, managed services, cybersecurity, a lot of different technical aspects, but we leverage with them and use them on our audits to do the requirements that we have as professionals to understand the IT systems, how it relates to internal controls over financial reporting, as well as a quick dive into some cybersecurity issues and making sure that outside of scope of the financial audit that other systems are working in place. Chris does have experience with you somewhat recently, working on some projects with you. So I'm sure there's some people on the call that are familiar with the work of that group and with Chris. So we're pleased to be able to integrate that into the audit. And then for anyone who's not aware, we actually share a building with you. So we're just a couple floors above you. So I'm sure the working relationship will go very smoothly as we're pretty much neighbors. The next slide, the next three slides talk about, introduction of our firm. I assume most know us, especially if you look at the proposal, but basically we are what's called a regional firm. We're the 6th largest regional firm in New England. We have several accolades we've won over the last few years, which we're very proud of, including Best of the Best Firms, as well as Best of Hartford, 24 as well. So that needs to be updated. And we do work with the majority of quasi-publics in the state of Connecticut. The next three slides talk about the responsibilities of the audit. We are to perform a thorough and efficient audit in accordance with government auditing standards. That includes the financial statement audit as well as the programmatic audit. The audit is to provide reasonable assurance that material misstatements will be detected resulting from our audit procedures, as well as any significant deficiencies or material weaknesses within compliance or internal controls will be reviewed. If there are any, those will be reported as well. We take pride in proactively identifying any issues we come across, either with senior management or with the board or audit committee, depending on the level that may be required. Any enhancements in internal controls that we feel could be improved, we'll identify them and discuss, again, with the same groups with management or higher if needed. We are available for in-person meetings, very convenient, like I said, being in the same building with you. But if these meetings were to move in person, that's not a problem at all. We review the financial statements for any other information or commentary of trends or unusual items. So there's you prepare your statements, but if we find the need to add to them, especially if there's any new disclosure requirements, we do include that consulting to be able to work with you and implement anything that needs to be updated. And any, like I said, any other standards or footnotes, we would happy to be part of. The next slide is management's expectations. So in order for us to do our work, we need to ensure that management, we expect the following of management, which is to ensure compliance with all laws and regulations, to provide us with all financial records, including the financial statements and any supporting schedules that we need to be able to audit. At the end of the audit, they'll provide with a management representation letter that assures us that they've fully complied with everything we've asked for, and they haven't withheld any information from us. If there were ever any audit adjustments, they'd be responsible for making those adjustments. Importantly, to promote honest and ethical behavior throughout the organization. That's a management expectation as well as a governance expectation, and to communicate with us all significant matters that may have a potential impact on the statements. So as mentioned, we were engaged recently to do the upcoming audits. So what we've done internally already is the planning process, but the kickoff of the audit really starts now. We'll do our communication with certain members of the audit committee, with management. We'll start looking at some information, internal controls, some interim numbers, and we've already read some board minutes and developed some expectations internally, and the audit would really kick off very shortly to follow through on these things. The next slide is your expectations, being the audit committee. Really to set a tone at the top. The responsibility is to make sure that the organization from top to bottom understands the importance of being honest and ethical. Communicate with us any actual or suspected wrongdoing that's been brought to the committee's attention and investigated throughout the year. The first 2 or 3 slides had our contact information, emails, and phone numbers. We would expect that if there were any issues, you would communicate with us. We do a reach out of the committee through certain members. It won't be everybody, but we'll select somebody to contact on the audit committee, possibly the board, to ask certain questions to, just to check in and again, make sure that we're aware of anything going on. But there's a level of expectation that you understand the relationship we have with you, which is to be the independent auditor, to work for you, to help with these things. So if anything comes to your attention, we would ask that you reach out to us, not just during the audit, but during the year as well. And then finally, to provide feedback to us with the scope of the planned audit work. And then when we finish, if there's any commentary at the end as well. If you go on to the next slide, please. The initial audit timing, this may be off a little bit. This was the initial plan in the proposal. So we may be off a little bit. This is more of a routine audit when we are, really the second year. The first year is always a little bit slow, as the timing of meetings and introductory may be a little bit slow. But generally in the spring, we're doing a planning, preparing the work papers, rolling forward the work, reviewing the board minutes, preparing engagement letters to you, following up on prior year items. Then by May and June, we're doing our planning with management, with the audit committee and the board, scheduling the walkthroughs, the internal controls, compliance work as well, getting ready for year end. So we're trying to do a lot of that work before June 30th, which helps with the quick turnaround time and to really prepare for the final work, that we have a good plan going forward. The field work of the audit takes place in the summer. So generally July, August, September. That's really dependent upon really your schedules. We're fairly flexible with what we can provide. In my experience, by August, our clients like us to be, especially our quasi-publics, like us to be out there and doing the work, being done by early September, so that by the end of September and into October, we're doing the final review of the financial statements, the MD&A, the supplemental information. And then finally, we'll make sure that all the reports and communications are finalized prior to November 1st. Really what that means is that by early to mid-October, we're pretty much done and sending everything out to be reviewed for final drafts. And I believe the requirement is to have everything done by November 1st. So it'll be done in advance of that, so you can have your meetings and we can present to you at the end. I'm not sure if that was the last slide or not. I don't have my, I'm sorry, the audit scope. The audit scope is a pretty standard audit scope. We don't invent the work we do. We follow procedures that are set forth through the AICPA, but it's a top-down risk-based audit approach, and the testing across all financial line items. We do use materiality to consider what to test. But basically, all your financial assets get confirmed. Sampling occurs, especially through revenues and expenses. Analytical procedures are done mainly in the planning part of the audit, to develop expectations so we can identify certain areas to test a little bit more thoroughly, or to rotate testing as happens on certain items. But the bulk of our audit work is through substantive testings. That's confirmations, general account reconciliations, reviewing invoicing, doing the compliance work, which involves looking at eligibility, looking at the reporting requirements and other aspects of it. So that's pretty important, obviously, because there's certain liabilities that can be unknown if compliance is not followed through that. So we integrate that in the performance of our audit. A lot of that's going to be relevant to the revenue testing that we do. And of course, our approach is designed to meet our not only internal quality standards, but regulatory expectations. And we do get inspected every 3 years through an external peer review process. We just went through that last year, passed, no issues. And this comes up once in a while, and you may have asked this in your RFP, but one of the engagements picked was a quasi-public entity, and no issues were identified there. So I think that's some good information for you to have, to know that our quasi-public work is being looked at externally. Any questions as we move through this, by the way? I should have prefaced that I'm happy to take anything along the way.
Thomas, this is Claudio. Just a quick question on the couple slides before where you outlined the expected deliverables and timelines, and probably a question more for the Access Health CT leadership team, but wanting to know if substantively those deadlines and inflection points are almost identical to what we've been operating under, or if we've made any intentional shifts or changes to those timelines and reporting out.
Directly, I assume it's the same, but I'll let the staff answer the question.
Sure, I can answer that, Mr. Chairman. No, we are going by the standards that we already had in place, and working with Tom and his team to start the beginning phases of the audit.
Thank you, Holly, for confirming that, because I just want to make sure that the cadence of meetings for audit and finance committee as necessary sort of coincide. So if there's any shifts, I just want to make sure we're doing that seamlessly. And I appreciate you keeping that consistency and crosswalking to our schedules.
No problem. Thank you.
And that's why we have the November 1 deadline that Tom mentioned, because we'll have meetings scheduled with audit and finance committees in November, and then after audit, and finance receive the audits, and they will go to the board.
Excellent. Thank you, Susan.
All right. I'll wrap the our part up with this final slide. This is not a discussion slide at the moment, but more for everyone to have as reference. These are some of the fraud risk considerations that we talked about earlier that you would think of during the year, or if this were to come up during the year, you would reach out to us about. But basically, when we do our work, we're going to inquire the views about risks and fraud. But the knowledge of any actual suspected or alleged fraud, the Finance and Audit Committee oversight role for identifying and responding to risks, that is something that, as we take over, we'll be documenting what the processes and how certain things are handled if they were to come. But think about any communications from regulatories or third parties regarding fraud or violations of laws and regulations, whistleblower matters. And then finally, again, we ask that the finance and the audit committees continually be responsible to inform us of any of these matters. This is not something we expect to happen, and this is not something you want to happen, but it is, the responsibility of, primarily the audit committee to make sure that these areas are paid attention to, and that you have controls in place to address anything that were to happen. And again, I'll see if there's any questions and ask if there's any feedback that we have for this.
Tom, just one question. How do you integrate the IT audit aspects?
Yeah, so like I said, Chris it was in our IT group. He's primarily responsible for that, and again, he's worked with the organization in the past. He leads that up. So what we do is you have a contact that he will work with. There's a checklist of requirements to go through, and then there are the additional kind of best practices that we look at. I'll talk about the checklist first. The checklist at a very high level is that we understand the controls and the use of IT as it relates to financial reporting. So as you can imagine, IT is integral to the financial reporting. So it's a matter of looking at you have access to source codes and general ledger records. Where are the records stored? Who has access to those records? Who has access to general ledgers? What audit trail reports are available. So there's a series of steps that are followed for the audit. The other aspect of things is more on an ad hoc basis, where they'll look at things like, what do you do for cybersecurity? What are your IT controls? What security processes do you have? And it really evolves into, depending on what they find and what level they go down to. It's something extra that we offer just because we're already using them to look at the IT aspect of financial reporting. And what they're able to do is come up with a lot of things that people aren't either aware about, or new trends that we're seeing, and things that maybe were good 3 years ago, but really have improved since then, and things to look at. So it's really just that part of it. That second part of it is really more of just an additional value that we try to bring to the audit. And people get a lot of use out of it, because either you didn't know about something, or something's new, or you'd learn that there's another way to do something, and then they can help in the future if needed.
Thank you.
Thanks for the question. Anything else? we definitely look forward to working with you again and appreciate being selected. So, you know, and our role is going to be to communicate to you. So you'll hear from us along the way, and then certainly at the end as well.
Excellent. Thank you, Thomas. Appreciate that overview and presentation. I think that brings us next to Susan Richby, who will do the 2023 SMART audit.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. So the ACA requires state-based marketplaces to keep accurate accounting of all activities, receipts, and expenditures, and to monitor and report to HHS on our exchange-related activities, and also to complete an annual report and engage an independent auditor, Whittlesley, to perform annual independent financial and programmatic audits to ensure compliance with regulations and standards. So back in the early years in 2015, CMS developed an online annual reporting tool for exchanges so that they combined all of these requirements into one place, and it is known as the SMART, the State-Based Marketplace Annual Reporting Tool. The SMART has 4 components: eligibility and enrollment, financial and programmatic audits, program integrity, and an attestation of completion. So the SMART is due on June 1st of each year, and it is for the previous year. So Access Health filed our SMART for calendar 2023 on May 31st, and we anticipate hearing back from CMS in a few months. We did not find any issues when completing our responses and do not anticipate any recommendations or findings. So I'll pause if there are any questions. Okay,
Looks like
then
we're
I
all
guess.
set. Yep.
Yep, no, thank you. Then I can move on to our next agenda item is the State of Connecticut Auditors of Public Accounts. So we are gonna talk about the report that was recently released for FY 20 and 21, and also discuss that the state auditors have began their new audit with us for FY 22 and 23. So we are finally caught up and current. In the early years of the exchanges, it took a little while for them to get going, and the first audits took a few years until they released their report. So we were kind of behind, and so that's some of what I'll talk about today. Some of the, for this 20 and 21, you're going back several years for this information. So the report for 20 and 21 was released by the state auditors on May 15th. And give me one second, I'm trying to find my document. There it is, sorry. So I'm going to take you through, we had 6 findings in the report. So I will take everybody through these findings in these areas. And we also had prepared a memo that was sent out to all of the board members a few weeks ago on all of these items. So I'll just take you through these items. So the first finding was lack of compliance with data protection and statutory breach reporting. As you all know, Access Health recognizes the importance of strong information security controls, and we have numerous policies and procedures in place to prevent disclosure of consumer information. We take that responsibility very, very seriously. As part of this, we require all of our employees to complete annual privacy and security training, and we require any of our vendors whose employees have access to consumer information in our systems to likewise train their employees on privacy and security, along with having other systems and policies and procedures in place. And also, one of the things that we do is we have an IT security auditor who audits are some of what, Tom was mentioning, some of the services that Whittlesley may provide. We engage a separate auditor to audit our vendors, such as the call center and some of our vendors that have, access into our systems with our consumer information. So the report noted that there were 51 breaches during, it's actually slightly more than the time period that they looked at. And I just want to make sure that everybody understands that most of these incidents are not, none of these are big breaches of our systems, first of all. And most of these only involve one consumer or one household. And some of it, a lot of it is instances where either consumers have not updated their information with us, which unfortunately happened quite a bit during the pandemic period. With the continuous coverage requirements for Medicaid, we have Medicaid eligibility and enrollment coming through our system. So people could keep their Medicaid during that 3-year time period without, coming in and updating their information. So unfortunately, we didn't have up-to-date addresses for people. People moved, so notices may have been sent to the wrong address. And then the person who got it called us. So we treat that as a breach. But it's not, it's not a big incident, if you will. And just to note that none of our notices include any social security numbers or dates of birth. They have the consumer's name and address. Depending on what the notice is, it could have their annual income that, they may have listed in the application. And none of it includes any insurance numbers. The only identifying number is like a system ID number for the person, but there's nothing that anybody could do with that information. It's not someone's Medicaid number or their Anthem number, their Connecticut insurance number, nothing like that. But we just take the security so seriously that we do report them as breaches, and we notify the consumers as well. All the agencies we're required to notify, and we offer credit monitoring and identity theft protection in all those incidents. There was also one incident that impacted a larger number of consumers where we had implemented some new technology in our notice printing, and there was an issue with it, and so it wasn't separating for each consumer, so it was mailing multiple notices to one consumer got their notice as well as maybe the 3 after them, got all bundled into an envelope. And also in some of those instances, some of the notices actually had nothing more than the person's name and address. When someone elects to receive their notices online, in which case they get them through their online account and they don't have anything mailed to them, any system notices, we do send one first letter that says, you've elected to get your notices online. If this is incorrect, please contact us. So in some instances, it was just that letter that actually went to the wrong person. It was immediately found out and immediately corrected, and all the consumers were notified of this, as I said. And one of the other items in there was, because we have multiple entities that we're required to report to, there had been a period where we weren't aware that in addition to CMS and the Attorney General for the state of Connecticut, we were also required to send copies of the reporting to the auditors of public accounts and the Comptroller's office. So there were just 3 during this period that carried over that hadn't been sent to those 2 entities, but they were sent to everyone else. And then other than those 3, everything was sent to all of the reporting agencies. So I don't know if you'd like me to pause if anyone has any questions. If not, I can keep going. The second finding was lack of controls over eligibility and coverage overrides. We have 2 types of overrides that are used in our system. There are eligibility overrides and coverage overrides. Coverage overrides are used when a change in the effective date is needed. There may have been some issue with the consumer's enrollment or verifying some of their information. And so sometimes the date needs to be changed, the effective date of their coverage. So those are coverage overrides. The other type of overrides are eligibility overrides, actual eligibility for a program, whether it be enrollment in a QHP or financial assistance, with financial assistance, or for Medicaid and CHIP, which is managed by the Department of Social Services. Only Access Health employees are permitted to perform the eligibility overrides for QHP enrollees, and only DSS is permitted. They only allow their workers to perform the coverage overrides for their programs. Access Health is not permitted to do an eligibility override for those programs. So what was noted in this finding is that Access Health does prepare regular reports, and we're always looking at the volume and the overrides. And we also have a very well-staffed QA department internally, as well as the call center has a QA department. So QA is always being done on a regular basis every month, looking at workers' work and what overrides they might do as part of their work. And if there's any issue, that is always, the person is notified and the issue is corrected, and then the person, is also notified that they need to, fix their work as well, and notified that they made an error. And so in the instance that the auditors noted here, there were 3 instances from the sample provided to them where there was not documentation of why the overrides were performed in our CRM notes. One of those instances actually was not an override. We told the auditors that it was not an override. It was included in the sample. Someone had actually touched the override button, but actually was not performing an override. There was no override, so that's why there were no notes. It was just accidentally included in the sample, and the auditors still included it in this finding. And then the other 2 were done by DSS workers for Medicaid, where they did not document in the CRM. So that was what this finding is. So, going forward, we'll really work with all the different groups that are performing these types of overrides to make sure that the documentation is there in the CRM so that we have the audit trail. So I'll pause if anyone has any questions on that. If not, the next finding was weakness in purchasing processes, and the auditors noted some irregularities about the timing for signing purchase orders, documentation for certain, obtaining 3 quotes for certain purchases, and the processes for credit card purchases. Access Health has an internal, one of our accounting policies that requires for use of our credit cards. They are primarily for travel, but there are certain instances where a credit card may be needed for a software license or something that somebody else is purchasing that they need to use a credit card to purchase. Our policy had previously stated that any purchase over $600 required a purchase order and a W-9. That was not meant for travel, and so we've adjusted. That was meant for any other purchases over $600 with a credit card. So we adjusted the policy. Obviously, it wouldn't be possible to get a purchase order and a W-9 from an airline, if you will, or a hotel chain. So we adjusted the policy so the policy accurately reflects what we were doing in practice. And so on this one, we will make sure that the timing and that everything is documented properly and according to our policies. I'll pause if there are any questions.
Susan, how many transactions did this impact from the sample?
Pam, I don't know. I think Pam is on. Pam, I don't know if you can help me. I think it was a small number. I don't know what the percentage was from the sample.
It was definitely a small number. Keeping in mind that their samples are extremely targeted at certain types of transactions, so they're really not representative of our overall work. It would take me a minute to pull up the details of that.
We could come back to it then. If you could, the committee should have some context. Is the volume of this represents in terms of I don't want to discount the issue, but we do a ton of those transactions on a monthly basis. Yeah, I think this was a very low amount of transactions that they're referring to. So, Pam, can you look it up? Then we'll come back to it afterwards.
Yes,
thank you. I'm sorry, Susan.
No, thank you, James, and thank you, Pam. So the next one is inadequate documentation regarding criminal background checks. So Access Health under the ACA is required to have a navigator program and make navigator grants. So we created our rules. There's some rules in the ACA regs. We created some additional rules for our program, being cognizant that navigators, and just to back up, navigators are meant to provide an additional in-person assistance channel to consumers, or could be over the phone as well. So navigator organizations or organizations that may have specific populations. It may be geographical, it may be, a certain population around the state, a low-income population. We at Access Health understand the importance of in-person assistance to help people enroll. We always talk about how complicated it is to enroll in health insurance coverage or Medicaid. So we seek to provide as much assistance as possible. So navigators are one way that we do that. So every year we have a process where we do an RFP and we select navigator organizations, and then we contract with them. One of our requirements that we put into the contracts is we want to make sure that the people that are doing this work, because they have access to consumers' PAII when they're working with them on the application, that everybody is above board. So we require that all of the staff at the navigator that work for Access Health for the grant program have passed a criminal background check. And so the auditors were looking at our records for all of the people working at the navigator organizations and the background checks. And there was just one instance for FY21 where the organization, the employee in question had passed a background check, but the organization was unable to provide us with the documentation to certify that they had passed the background check. So going forward for FY22 and 23 and this year, we have worked with the navigators and all of the documentation is there, showing that everyone has passed the background check. And starting for our new contracts for the new fiscal year starting in July, we've added a requirement to the navigator contracts that they have to provide us with a written certification regarding personnel passing background checks. We just want to make sure that we are doing everything we can to make sure that people's information is protected through all of these different channels. I'll pause if anyone has any questions there. Okay, and the next one is inadequate overtime monitoring. So due to the nature of our work, because of the cycle of open enrollment and different things that occur during the year, implementing Covered Connecticut, what have you, a lot of things come up. Periodically, we require our internal customer resolution team staff to work overtime so that we keep, don't have big backlogs, so that we get back to consumers and help them as soon as possible. We know how important this is. And also, as I mentioned, this in-person assistance that we really work hard to provide. We hold enrollment fairs, especially during open enrollment and during the past year with the Medicaid unwinding going on. We actually held them every month during the year. And so in addition to other staff, we also ask our customer resolution team to help at these fairs. And sometimes they're at night or on weekends. We schedule them at times when consumers are available to come do this. So overtime is sometimes needed for staff to work at those. So our process in place, we do have a requirement that overtime be pre-approved. The managers of that team will send out emails saying, when overtime is approved for people to work overtime, whether it be to reduce or prevent a backlog or to work at these enrollment fairs. And there were a very minor number of hours for the overtime that they looked at that because of this was going back into 2020. And some people have moved on from Access Health. We couldn't locate the emails, the documentation showing that the overtime was pre-approved. And we also noted that in addition to the pre-approval that happens in those emails, when everyone's payroll is submitted every 2 weeks. The manager has to approve it. So if there was an irregularity or something that came up with regard to overtime, that would be caught before the 2 weeks of time was submitted for payroll processing. So that is a backup to prevent any misuse of overtime.
Again, Susan, how many people, how many employees are we talking about here with respect to this this particular issue?
I think it was only 3 people, and it was literally like 12 hours. We had a difference of opinion on approval of something, so the auditors said it was 17 under our records, and what we've looked at, it was 12. And that accounted for 1% of all of the overtime worked during that period. So it was very small. It was a few $100s, and it was, it was actually worked and needed. Okay, so moving on, the last finding is lack of compliance with statutory reporting. We have several in addition to the financial and programmatic audits, the SMART, all of these different audits that we do. We also have requirements under our enabling legislation and also the Quasi-Public Act for reports that need to be filed, annual and quarterly reports, pursuant to 1-123 of the Connecticut General Statutes. And we provide regular financial reports to the Finance Committee, to this Audit Committee, and to the board as well. So there was a period where we had been backlogged with some of those reports, getting those reports in. All the reports were filed. It was the timing of when they were filed. And there was also a notation, our investment policy requires semi-annual and annual reporting on the investment funds. And all of our investment funds, when the policy was written back in 2012, it was written in a way as if anticipating that we might be actively trading a portfolio of funds. Access Health has decided early on not to go down that path with our reserve funds. So all of the reserve funds have always been maintained in an account with the State of Connecticut Treasurer's Short-Term Investment Fund, the STIF, as people probably know it as, less risky, and just, we've preferred to do it that way as well. So we always report at the quarterly meetings to all of the committees and to the board on the balances that are in the reserves and any interest that's been earned. We just weren't calling it a semi-annual or annual investment report. So we now have started doing that and have started calling it that. That was one of the items that the auditors noted. But all of the information required in those reports has always been reported to these committees and to the board throughout the year.
Mr. Chairman, I believe that concludes our review of the 6 items that were identified in the state auditor's report. As Susan indicated, we take everything that's reported to us very seriously, and we respond accordingly. But as we all agree within the staff, these are not major items of concern for us. The one item that there were 151 we call it a breach. Not all of them were true breaches because no one hacked into our system, stolen any information. They were just mailings that went out to the wrong people. And once we knew about those, we corrected that immediately and contacted the impacted folks as well. But it's about 151 folks that were impacted by that. So this is where we are. We are ready to answer any questions from the committee, and we intend on doing a similar presentation to the board next Thursday as well. And this reflects the document we sent to the board about 2 weeks ago that identified everything Susan just mentioned.
And with regard, as I mentioned earlier, that we engaged, an independent IT security auditor with our vendors, especially the call center. Their workers are doing enrollment and in the system. We've also added additional reporting and penalties on our contract with them to, we're always stressing to them and looking at different ways to reduce any human error, but we've added additional reporting requirements and penalties, and that has actually helped. So we're glad about that. Unless it's very hard to completely eliminate that aspect, unfortunately.
Yes, this is Claudio again. Thank you. I want to thank Susan for in rapid fashion, informing and keeping the board aware of all of the specific findings and showing us the due diligence that the Access Health CT leadership team took in each one, providing written responses, entertaining all of our questions, and giving us really good sense of one, context. Obviously some of these things have varying degrees of severity, and when we know all of the operating facts and the circumstances surrounding them, the type of breach versus a hack certainly is helpful at contextualizing it, and I appreciate that. I also appreciate, James, the leadership and willingness that you have been to be very transparent in informing the chairs of cognizance, the legislature, taking seriously in our contracting and where we can add enforcement tools in vendor contracts to reflect the findings and to do better and ensure privacy protections of the people we serve. I think that's really encouraging. I also appreciate today's conversation where we dedicated a significant amount of time for the board and the subcommittee, in particular the committee, audit committee, to have a chance to fully digest and answer any questions. And I will also be part of the meeting that's following up, the forum with legislators, just to sort of continue to understand all the action steps that we have heard and how we intend to put them in place. So with that, I'll pause and see if any other board members have questions, but I do want to just express my appreciation for the seriousness for which you took these and the courtesy and detailed information you provided to the board to help us fully understand in context what were the findings and the remediation actions that took place. Thank you.
Thank you.
I think
Matt
has a question. Yeah.
No question. I just want to echo Claudio's comments, but also sort of note that Access Health, as we've talked about, is this big target, right? You get a lot of money, a lot of transactions, a lot of staff, either directly or contracted, and I think, Susan, to your point, while serious and you all took them seriously, these audit filings are not exactly the world's biggest thing, right? And I think it's because of the diligence that you all do in terms of the work you do, and I just really appreciate everything. So
thank you much.
And then, just as I mentioned, the auditors notified us just as they were issuing the report for 20 and 21 that they were ready to start working on the new audit for 22 and 23. So we've already started working with them already for a few weeks, right, Holly? Yeah.
That's correct, Susan. Yes. Yep. We sure have been already, gathering info and submitting it after review. Yes.
And having them caught up, and the audit not being, from a time period 4 years ago or 6 years ago in some cases, also will help.
Most definitely.
And also, a lot of the issues from 2020, 21 have been addressed back when they identified them to us. So and once we found out about them, so it's ironic that in 2024, even though the issues have been addressed, but they still report them as if they happened yesterday. But they think that's the nature of auditing. I used to be an auditor myself. They have to do their job, and so we are where we are. We are who we are, and we'll continue to do our best to avoid to minimize any of these issues from reoccurring.
And we are very immediate about making these updates that we need to make or changes in, internal policy. We try to do those as soon as possible and realize how important it is. And, even though we say they're, little, it's still an audit. It's a major deal, and we take it very, very seriously. And thank you for all your comments today.
Just a question, Susan. Do the audit, once you respond to the issues that the auditors have raised, do they ever get back to you and say, okay, we think that's a reasonable solution, or they just continue forward and don't look back to say we're reconciled?
It really depends. Sometimes their initial set of findings, they may come to us and we'll go back, we'll provide them with maybe more information or just discuss it with them. And sometimes they decide it's not a finding, and so they'll drop it. So there is a back and forth process. And if you look at the audit report, you'll see, they write up their finding. We are provided with an opportunity and space to respond, which we always do. And then in a couple of instances, they seem to now want to respond back again. So they'll say something again. And then, like auditors do, as Tom mentioned, with the next audit, they'll follow up on these findings, definitely in their work. So, the hope is that these will be dropped, will not appear. Obviously, that is always the goal in the next audit. And, Ted Doolittle used to say, audits are also a good way to, sometimes you realize that there was something, maybe it's like I referred to the credit card policy, that there's something that we all knew internally, this was our policy, but it wasn't how we actually wrote it in the policy. So sometimes, there are instances like that where you realize you need to, make a change on something because it's not saying what it's meant to say.
I got you.
So it's good in that sense.
Thank you.
Actually, that's the value of having external folks coming in, looking at it objectively and giving us feedback. It does make us better going forward. So the example Susan gave was a good example. We were doing it right, but our policy did not reflect what we were doing. So just having that external perspective can help us to make adjustments as needed.
I got you. Yeah.
With that, and seeing no other comments from board members, I think that moves us to the last item for business, and we will conclude right on time, it seems, which is a motion for adjournment. Have such motion?
Tom McNeil, so moved.
Thank you, Tom. Second?
Carleen Zambetti, second.
Thank you, Carleen. Motion moved and seconded. Roll call to approve the adjournment and conclude our meeting.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. Claudio Gualtieri,
Yes.
Grant Ritter,
Yes.
Thomas McNeil,
Yes.
Carleen Zambetti,
Yes.
Matthew Broekman.
Yes.
Thank you. Motion passes.
Thank you, everyone. Have a great day.
Take care.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Bye.
Thank you, everyone.